Today I will be demonstrating how to create a ceramic piece that has the appearance of a mosaic using a wax resist method, where the wax resist will go over the design and a wax grid will be placed over the design, with the end result being fragmented areas of glaze, having a similar appearance to mosaic without using the traditional method of creating mosaic using fragments of ceramic, glass, and other materials. This particular piece was created using a low-fire commercial tile. However, if you want to create a piece using mid-range or high-fire clay, you can easily make a tile using a high-fire clay body. So for this piece, I used the low-fire commercial tile and then painted the background in a brown underglaze so that it would have the appearance of terracotta once fired. For the piece I will demonstrate today, I will just be using the color of the tile, so the background will be more of a white color. So I will repeat the design with some changes. Here I used translucent and semi-translucent glazes, and for this tile I will be using opaque glazes in a similar color palette, but just a little bit different. So the design I'm using is a design I use quite often. It's this 3-leaf design with a border. And in this case, I'll be working with a green color palette. I will transfer the design onto the tile. It doesn't have to be exact, but pretty close. The grid lines have been drawn on the tile. Now I'll go ahead and draw the leaf design in the center square of the tile. When I'm planning the design, I want to be mindful of the small areas. I need to plan so there is enough room for glaze once the wax lines have been applied. In my sketchbook design, this area here appears as 2 fragments, but this is really close. So one option I have is to incorporate this top line into the grid line rather than change the angle of the leaf. Here there's 2 schools of thought. One, to do the design in wax first. The other is to lay down the grid in wax. And the reason for that is that if you have to alter the design to avoid large areas of wax where the lines intersect, it's easier to change the design than to change the grid lines. You can apply the wax using either a brush or a slip trailer bottle. If you're going to use a brush to apply the wax, it's recommended to use a brush with synthetic bristles. I'll go ahead and apply the wax. Notice if you find it more comfortable to apply brush strokes in a vertical direction or in a horizontal direction. Also, before you begin, I suggest making a little line of wax on the back of your piece. That will kind of give you an idea of how thick that line will be. If you do this on a piece of paper, it's going to be different than when you're actually working on the tile. Also, if you do this on a leather hard piece of clay versus a bone dry piece of clay or bisqueware, it's going to be different. You'll want to have an idea of how the wax is going to glide across the piece and also the quality of the line. So consider doing a little test on the back of the piece first. You might not see the line at first. Only when it starts to dry does it darken. I prefer to apply the wax in a vertical line, and I'm using my finger to stabilize my hand and the brush. And I continue in a straight line down the tile even if I feel that I've run out of wax. Once it dries, if it does appear that the line started to get a little thinner, then I'll go back over it once again. After going over the grid, I go over it a second time. It's not really necessary, especially if you can see the line. It's just something that I do. I'll now go over the design in wax. With any type of design or technique, I want to make sure that where the lines meet, intersect, or end, that they are clearly defined. Make sure this point here is clearly defined. Where this line meets this line is clearly defined. When going over it a second time, it's really important to make sure to pay attention to these areas. It's really easy when you're applying a line for your brush or tool to just lift off and not complete the line. Whenever I'm doing any type of surface design technique, incising, sgraffito, painting, I double check where lines meet, where they end, where they intersect, and make sure they are clearly defined. So now I'll let the wax dry before I apply the glaze. And you want to pay attention to whatever the manufacturer recommendations are as far as how much time to let the wax dry. Some manufacturers say you're ready to apply glaze within 15 minutes to a half an hour. Other manufacturers recommend 2 hours, 4 hours, 6 hours. Others say overnight. So I would take whatever recommendation given and maybe go a little bit longer than that. But again, I tend to be a little more conservative in my approach. So another thing I wanted to mention is that in addition to putting the wax on the front of this tile, I'll also carry it over to the side so that the glaze will also be on the side of the tile, having the appearance of fragments or shard of ceramic or glass. Wax will be placed on the bottom, and then the lines will carry over. I also do this not just when working on a tile, but also when I work on a vase form or a pot form. So this is a different technique, but very similar, but you see that the glaze carries over from the side of the vessel over to the lip of the vessel, and then giving that appearance of little fragments or shards of ceramic or glass. So now I'll just go ahead and add that line of wax. And now I will extend the grid lines from the top of the tile along the side of the tile. Once the sides have been waxed, I will let that dry and then begin to apply the glaze onto the tile. I can apply the glaze onto the tile using a brush or slip trail bottle. In this particular case, I will be using brushes. I will switch from using the synthetic brushes that I use to apply the wax to my low fire glaze brushes. If I'm working in high fire, then I will switch over to my Sumi brushes to apply the glaze onto the piece. When applying the glaze, I'll work from the inside out and then also from light to dark. In this particular case, because I'm using a brush, I have two ways that I could approach the glazing. So one would be to go in and individually fill each one of these sections, but they're all going to be the same color. And so if I brush the glaze, which I'll demonstrate in a second, over the entire leaf, then the wax will repel the glaze. And then I just go ahead and apply my 2 to 3 coats to the entire surface, knowing that as I'm applying these stripes and these large areas, the wax is going to be repelling the glaze. If I were to choose a slip trailer applicator, then I would want to outline the section and then flood the color inside. And I do that for a different wax technique, which I'll demonstrate in another video. But I could also just apply the slip trail across the entire surface and the wax resist would repel the glaze, but it just seems easier to outline and flood when using the applicator. I'll begin adding glaze to the leaf here on the far left. And as you can see, the wax repels the glaze. And we'll continue adding colors to the rest of these leaves and then the background and the outside borders. I'll now go ahead and fill in this center leaf. And although I did little strokes on this one, normally that's not the way I apply glaze. I tend to do it in long strokes in one direction. Just start here, going along the line, coming up to a point there. So I'll just continue. Now we'll go ahead and fill in the background. Now apply the inner portion of the border. So I had found that I went an extra row of blue than I needed to. So I just wiped that off with a sponge and then let that dry. And now I've gone over it with the correct color. So that was an easy correct. And now I will apply the first coat of the last color, so the outside border. Three coats of glazes have been placed on the tile, and then also glaze has been placed along the side of the tile. I also wanted to mention that the glaze will repel, but in certain areas, if it doesn't, you can easily just dip a brush in water and go over that area. And it will clean that area up easily, but not disturb the glaze and the areas that haven't been waxed. To review, this tile has translucent glazes on a dark background, and this piece will have opaque glazes on a white background. Again, for this technique, a commercial tile was used, wax resist, and low fire glazes. It could also be done in high fire. In that case, I would hand build a tile using high fire clay, still use the wax resist, and then either paint individual glazes, as I did in this tile, or the entire hand-built tile, once fired, could be dipped into a glaze, and then the areas would be fragmented. So if I wanted something translucent, maybe I would dip it into a Celadon or Oribe, and if I wanted something opaque, I would choose an opaque glaze. And there's a lot of different ways that you could approach that, but it would be one solid color, but in the end look fragmented. So a lot of different options for this technique in both low fire and high fire. In the end, you will end up with these fragmented areas of glaze having a similar look to mosaic. This technique lends itself to a lot of possibilities with a couple of different variations depending on whether or not you're using low fire or high fire clay.